everyone, I hope you're well. Welcome to my forecast for the upcoming Gemini New Moon, which happens on May the 30th, I think. So this is going to be the forecast for the waxing moon cycle that will take us kind of to mid-June. And it's an interesting one. It's 1 month on from the solar eclipse that we had at the end of April, so from that Taurus solar eclipse. And you might start to see some of the energies from that solar eclipse start to kind of manifest or show themselves in the world. But also, much like that new moon, it also comes at the end of a month. So the reason for that is because the solar and the lunar months don't exactly match up. So we do sometimes have kind of crossovers where the calendar months and the lunar months don't quite sort of sync up. But nonetheless, this is essentially the waxing moon cycle that's going to take us, as I said, into the first 2 weeks of June. And it's a really interesting one. You know, I thought I wasn't going to have anything to say about it because there's not a lot kind of happening from a kind of transit point of view. But then I kind of ended up going on a little journey that was kind of sparked off, first of all, by the Sabian symbol that's active during this particular new moon phase, and then also by the ancient relationship between Mercury and Saturn. You know, Saturn's known as Mercury Senex, and it took me to some very, very interesting places and to the work of a man called Romanyshyn, who you may or you may not know. He's a Jungian analyst and a very interesting guy. I actually was privileged enough to hear him give a talk in London a few years ago, and his work has always really influenced my own, particularly his book The Wounded Researcher, which is about this kind of phenomenological approach to research where you allow yourself to be implicated in the work. You don't try and sort of take this scientific approach where you try to take yourself out of whatever it is that you're studying. You see it more as a kind of a dialogue or a relationship between you and the material. And I came across some new work that he's done, particularly around technology, which I found fascinating because obviously it's one of my, kind of preoccupations. So bear with me because, as I say, it took me to some really interesting places and helped me to see things from a kind of fresh perspective, but also from quite a hopeful perspective, and at a time when things kind of felt a little bit dark and gloomy. So, that is another theme of this new moon, fresh perspective. So, you might be interested in what kind of the little journey that I kind of took, particularly if you're interested in initiation, because there's a lot in this new moon about inversion and about kind of turning things on their head. So let's dive in and we can kind of get into things in more depth. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Now, in terms of overall kind of energies, just to kind of get the basics out of the way, we are talking about Gemini, which is mutable air, and of course that is really to do with things like kind of plasticity of thought, but also of communications. And I think it feeds into this idea of fresh perspectives, which I think is so big at this particular new moon phase. But on top of that, Mercury is retrograde and will be retrograde until the 3rd of June. So kind of it's still very much in that phase where it's asking us to kind of go back and revisit or rethink the past. I had such a wonderful journey myself as a result of where the symbols took me around Saturn and Mercury, because of course the two of them are going to be square at this new moon. And also I think it's interesting that Mercury will also be making a loose minor grand trine with Neptune and Pluto. And although this particular aspect pattern never perfects, I think it is calling on us to try and reconcile the Plutonian sort of aspect of things, which is about hard truths and sometimes truths that can take us to dark places or that force us to look at things we don't want to look at, that may feel awful or terrifying. And then on the other hand, the kind of Neptunian energies which tend to push us towards fantasy and escapist leanings. And again, I think there's a lot in that with where the Saturn-Mercury journey sort of takes us. But I think the other aspect of it, particularly with Neptune and Pluto, is projection. And I'm seeing a lot of that at the moment, kind of out in the world, particularly on social media. And I think it's so interesting how people get demonized and all sorts of things get sort of projected onto them that people don't necessarily want to kind of deal with. And this aspect of what's monstrous or what is scary again comes into kind of in the way that we view Saturn in particular, and that's something that the Robert Romanyshyn really teases out so nicely. So I want to kind of get into that as well. And so I think all these themes are kind of coming together quite nicely and asking us at this Gemini new moon not to sort of skim along the surface of things, but to really kind of allow ourselves to perhaps dive a little deeper. It is the start of retrograde season, and this is when many of the outer planets start turning retrograde. So it does tend to make us more introspective, and I think that's probably a good thing at this time. Pluto's already retrograde, and Saturn and Neptune will both turn retrograde in June, and then of course several other planets will follow in July. And retrograde season is a time when things start to slow down in the outer world, but we start to also become a little bit more, as I say, introspective. We start to sort of take what we see or discover or encounter in the world and then start to kind of cook it within us, much like, the I Ching and the cauldron. And from that can come a lot of meaning and meat, if you like, which I think can help us to navigate this period, which can otherwise often be quite confusing and sometimes a little bit disillusioning. So yes, I mean, overall, I think with new moons we do tend to get this kind of burst of fresh energy. We do start to feel a bit more like we want to kind of go out and do things, and I think that will be enhanced by the fact that Mars and Jupiter were making a conjunction on the day before this new moon. So that tends to boost self-confidence. It tends to also make us want to kind of go out and make our dreams happen, and in that sense it's very positive. It's great for career and for success in the world. But I think what it can also do is lead us into a kind of a might is right type of attitude. So I think that energy is better employed internally to sort of help us to get clear about what it is that we believe and what values we want to kind of align ourselves with, because I do think that we are kind of at this point where a lot of us are being challenged to unplug from the matrix again, from the hive mind, and just get clear about what it is that we believe, and then to kind of align ourselves with those beliefs so that outer and inner start to kind of match again. Now, of course, before we go any further, it's always good to kind of get this the cheat sheet out the way. So this is going to be your kind of indication of where you're kind of pressing the reset button in terms of a life area. So this is just, the sun and the moon will be on the same side of the earth, so there's one house or life area to identify. So just find your rising sign from this table, and then that will give you an idea of, kind of literally what you're most likely to sort of benefit from in terms of this new moon energy, where you can sort of start new projects or initiatives, that kind of thing. So anyway, feel free to pause the video, and but I'm going to carry on with the forecast. So as I was saying, the Sabian symbol for this month's new moon in Gemini was really kind of served as the inspiration for the themes of this forecast, and it's such an interesting one. So it is a plane dives towards the earth as though falling, so you get this idea of a nosedive happening, and it immediately made me think of something that was kind of a core proponent of a lot of my research when I did my dissertation at the University of Canterbury, and when I did my my master's. And inversion is such a big theme in many forms of initiation, and so it made me think a lot about that, about turning things on their head and seeing things from a different perspective. And as I say, initiation to a large extent is about that. It's about turning things like our attitude to death on its head. There's that famous saying, he who dies before he dies does not die when he dies. And that ties so strongly into the themes of Saturn, which we'll kind of look at a little bit further on in the forecast. But it's also about, as I say, fresh perspectives. It's about, as I mentioned when I did that forecast last month, which was entitled Initiation, the lunar eclipse in Scorpio, that a lot about initiation is about cutting off our heads, about seeing things from a different perspective. And I think that this Sabian symbol really kind of plays to that. So it's about kind of, Linda Hill takes it quite literally, and she talks about things like plunging into situations without considering the ramifications. But it can also be about becoming conscious of what's happening, so waking up almost. Sometimes it can be about being protected or saved at the last minute, or defying gravity. It can be about facing the consequences of our actions, or kind of, escaping sort of like death. I do think it's interesting that as I say, that it is so associated with these ideas of quite a reckless behavior, refusing to save yourself, free falls, nose dives, that kind of thing. But I want to kind of revision it in a new way, and I want to see it as being, a plane flies in the sky. So it's synonymous with the element of air, and as we saw a couple of months ago when we had that, I think it was the full moon in Libra, where we also had this symbol of a plane. That, when you're kind of high up, you do see things from a much kind of wider perspective, a much more detached perspective. And I think what I want to do now is take that a step further and look at it from the perspective of, as I say, initiation. So taking the Scorpio full moon sort of themes, and now taking those a step further and looking at what initiation means, and how the sort of mental processes involved. Because, as I say, we are talking about both Mercury and Saturn, and both of those are, to a large extent, particularly before the discovery of planets like Uranus, those are the two planets most associated with the intellect and with contemplation and that kind of thing. If this is useful, by all means, stop and sort of take it on board in your own life. But for me, this idea of the nosedive is much more to do with inversion. So I want to kind of take a much more hopeful kind of approach than this symbol might at first sort of intimate. And, one of the reasons for doing that is to do with the lunar face. So, of course, the lunar face is about the 5-degree kind of orb of this new moon. So for James Burgess, this is about fresh perspectives. And, I was looking for an image for this slide, and I came across, this image of a kind of like a crystal ball, and I thought it was fascinating the way it inverted an image, much the same way as photography used to kind of print the reverse image of something before they did kind of, there's the whole kind of negative and the positive process of film processing. And it really made me think about this idea of kind of backwards and forwards, up and down, and that kind of thing. And I think it fits so well with the themes of the lunar face. So these are about things like, progress is about taking risks as we follow our urges to enrich our experience of life. And he talks a lot here about blending our commonalities with our differences. So each of us brings a unique perspective to the table, and in that sense, that is one of our differences. But of course, we are all human beings. We all have similar kinds of experiences, no matter what our kind of background or culture. And in that sense, we can come together in terms of our commonalities. So this is, again, this interesting idea about same versus different. And I think also there's a lot in this forecast about sacredness, about the need to reintroduce the sacred back into ordinary life. And, he kind of says, it is the sacredness of self that disallows capitulation, so we must act to oust oppressors or doubters. So it's an interesting kind of inversion where, instead of looking to the external and to other people for approval, we are being asked to kind of maybe take a fresh perspective of our own experience, and to understand that, to kind of come back to our center and almost trust, that inner process to sort of lead us in a new direction, and that's why I think he says we can rely upon our inner natures to drive all impulses towards freshness and renewal. Sometimes we can get stuck, we can get caught in this sort of web of what I would call the hive mind, of kind of the space of kind of assumptions and projections. I can't remember who it was, called the internet the sort of like the superhighway of the id, and it can be that kind of place where we're going to get stuck in this almost sort of underworld of people's subconscious projections, and a lot of kind of dumping ground for detritus that we don't really want to kind of deal with. And sometimes, in order to maintain our sort of sense of sovereignty or our kind of sacredness of self, we need to actually take a step back from that, and from that kind of collective energy, and almost sort of press the reset button and trust our inner process to lead us in the direction in which we we need to go. And so I think it's interesting that he also talks about the fact that in the realm of ability, the mind is king. So this is where it starts, is your kind of your consciousness. Once you start to shift your perspective, very often everything else follows. And I think now we're kind of being asked to lean more towards the sort of the mental rather than the kind of the passionate, which the Venus has kind of predominated, I think, certainly since her retrograde at the beginning of the year. And I think we're being asked to move more into that sort of mercurial energy where we are somewhat more detached, and we're able to sort of analyze things from much more of a kind of an intellectual sort of perspective, and this is what is going to help us to shift into fresh energy. So that, I think, is really where we need to sort of place ourselves on that spectrum, if you like. Now, in terms of the chart itself, it's actually a fairly simple one. There's not a lot happening with the new moon itself. You can see that that the sun and the moon are at around about 9 degrees and 3 minutes of Gemini, and they aren't really aspecting anything. You know, they're making a square to the ascendant, but of course that ascendant is simply the line of the horizon, and that's going to be different depending on where you are in the world. But what I do find interesting is that Mercury is rising, and one of the things that I was made aware of when I was doing this forecast is that Mercury is strongly associated, because of its association with liminality, with this idea of the horizon, that Mercury can kind of go between worlds. And of course, in the ancient cosmology, the horizon was seen as the dividing line, or the sort of the border, the threshold between the sort of the ordinary world of kind of waking consciousness on the one hand, which is above the horizon, so it's the diurnal part of the chart, and then the more kind of subterranean aspect of the chart, the lower part of the chart, the lunar part of the chart, which is associated more with things like the subconscious, but also with the underworld. And of course, you know, for the ancients, the underworld wasn't necessarily a negative place. It was just the realm of the dead. It was only kind of later that it got these overlays of kind of being hell, you know, which came with sort of Christianity. But yes, I think it is interesting that Mercury, as I say, is the ruler of the line of the horizon, and we're going to get into that a little bit more when we look in more detail at Mercury and Saturn and their relationship. But as I say, the Sun and the Moon not making a lot of aspects to anything, you know, for this particular new moon. They are making a conjunction to the part of the honourable acquaintance, and so there might be some themes around like trust, loyalty, doing the right thing, integrity when it comes to the people around you. That might be, you know, a theme. But other than that, you know, Mercury seems to be the planet that is most predominant. And it's interesting if you look at the essential dignities that Mercury, you know, it is somewhat detrimented, but it's quite active. You know, it's making a square to Saturn, so we can see Mercury here at sort of like 26 degrees of Gemini, and you can see that it's forming part of a T-square with the nose to Saturn. And of course Saturn is very prominent at the moment because of the fact that we're in that new solar eclipse 6-month cycle, and you know, Saturn, as I said, was prominent at the Taurus new moon, and you particularly, you know, around the Saros cycle. So it had a lot to do with things like adulting, mastery, stepping into roles of responsibility, that kind of thing. So Mercury making a square to Saturn, and those two things almost being at odds. So on the one hand, you've got Saturn, you know, which is a lot to do with our kind of our conscience, with doing the right thing, with being quite serious. And then you've got Mercury on the other hand, that's a bit of a trickster and much more of a light-hearted energy that wants to kind of skim over the surface of things, that doesn't necessarily want to take responsibility for stuff. And again, we'll see this in the archetypes that are kind of like constellated around these two symbols when we get into Mercury and Saturn. But essentially you were talking about the old man, and or the kind of wizard on the one hand with Saturn, and then the sort of the puer on the other with Mercury. Venus is also very dignified, and of course she's had a very good week, you know, other than that square that she made to Pluto. She's had quite a good week in terms of aspects to the outer planets. So, and she's also in her own sign. She's kind of ingressed into Taurus, and I think really asking us to kind of root ourselves in embodied life, and in nature and the five senses and that kind of thing. And then I also mentioned this a little bit earlier, this minor grand trine between Neptune, Pluto and Mercury. So again, Mercury at this apex of several kind of aspect patterns. You can see this this kind of blue triangle that Mercury is making to Neptune and to Pluto. So it's making a red triangle to Saturn, and it's making a blue sort of triangle to Neptune with Pluto. And as I say, this is an interesting one because it doesn't perfect. You know, Pluto is retrograde, so it's moving away from Neptune. Neptune will retrograde later on in June, but the two planets are moving in the opposite direction, so they never quite make their sextile. But of course, Mercury, you know, it's also retrograde, but it will turn direct on the 3rd of June. So it's interesting how we're getting all this backwards and forwards movement, which I think is echoing this idea, as I say, of inversion, of kind of up and down. And as I say, an interesting time of liminality and of kind of shifts happening. And I think it's good to sort of try to remain open and adaptable to what kind of happens now, because I don't think that there's anything that's particularly fixed at the moment. I think it's more about a time of, as we let things go and we open ourselves into that sort of interim period between what we've known, what was and what is, that it's good to stay open and receptive and just kind of listen almost to see what messages come in, because I think, as I say, it could turn a few things on their head, and it could make us see things from a different perspective. But also just being aware, as I said, with Neptune and Pluto, of the need to be both realistic on the one hand, but not cynical, you know, with Pluto, and then on the other hand with Neptune being open to the magical, but not getting carried away with fantasy. So it's kind of walking that fine line, and I think Mercury allows us to do that if we are playful and loose enough to allow that to happen without, as I say, just skimming over the surface of things. So allowing ourselves to kind of dive deep when we're being called to. Yeah, so an interesting one. So again, this for me was also really interesting. That again, this kind of is what sent me on my kind of journey of discovery. So in terms of fixed star aspects, there's nothing happening really with the Sun and the Moon, but Mercury is making a conjunction to the fixed star Algol. And of course we encountered Algol back in November 2021 when we had that lunar eclipse in Scorpio, and at that time the Moon was making a conjunction to Algol. And one of the myths, or the sort of the themes that was constellating at the time, was this idea of letting go of like demonizing feminine sort of like archetypes. So the kind of classic myth that came up at the time was that of Medusa, and of course Medusa is Medusa's head is where the fixed star Algol is placed in terms of the constellation of Perseus. This is where Algol is found. So it was Perseus who cut off the head of Medusa after kind of sneaking up on her, you know, wearing the cloak of invisibility. So Pluto's cloak of invisibility, and he kind of cut off her head. And there's this, you know, we tend to think of her as this monstrous kind of woman who turns people to stone, but what we don't necessarily know in terms of her backstory, and this was the whole kind of thing about that lunar eclipse, is that she was once a beautiful goddess, a moon goddess, a priestess of Athena, who was turned into this disfigured mythical monster by Athena for having an affair with the god of the sea, Poseidon. And so she was kind of punished by another female. But now we're being asked to sort of move away from, you know, that was more kind of, as I say, because of the Moon, we were talking about feminine archetypes. Now with Mercury is sort of neutral. But I think, you know, what it's asking us to do in conjunction with Algol is to have some dialogues with our inner wounding, and from this kind of get fresh perspectives, particularly in terms of our fears or what we find scary in others, you know. And this is where I think projection and mirroring really kind of comes into play, you know, with that Neptune-Pluto sextile. But equally it could be about self-sabotage, inhibitions, or demonizing others with the Mercury-Saturn square, and we're going to get into both of those in a little bit more detail. But what I also find so fascinating is this idea of demonizing or demons versus the Greek word daemon. And this has kind of brought about a lot of misunderstandings about so-called monsters, a tendency to sort of demonize what we don't understand. And I think this plays so well into this Mercury Algol conjunction. And again, it's something I want to kind of get into, particularly around the archetype of Saturn, who today has become so much a kind of like a hate figure culturally, because of you know, his association with patriarchy. So I want to get into that in a little bit more detail too. As Robert Romanyshyn reminds us, it is actually, in our current sort of day and age, it is the monsters that hold the sense of the sacred in our culture right now. And it's important work to go to, what he says is to go to the margins and to recover what has been demonized, because therein potentially lies our kind of our healing and our recovery of what is lost. As a kind of a starting point, you know, I was thinking about Mercury retrograde and how it's the one sort of thing on the internet that is kind of really well known in terms of like folklore. So I thought it was interesting. I came across this article in Harper's Bazaar all about Mercury retrograde and its origins by a guy called Joe Livingston. And he was kind of saying Mercury rules the internet, and Mercury retrograde is an internet phenomenon, which is why it's talked about so much on social media. And I thought this was a really interesting departure point for looking at Mercury and Saturn. So, for example, you know, he kind of says further on in the article about Mercury retrograde, he says, in an era when we are reliant on the accurate transmission of meaning and data from one place to another, when everything we say or post or send is so open to misinterpretation and bad faith reading, whether on social media, group chats or Slack, for example, a whole discourse has sprung up around Mercury's supposed effect on the tech that's closest to our heart. So here we're kind of marrying this idea of Mercury retrograde, demons, and kind of tech. And I do think that this is a place where we do tend to see the most extreme forms of projection happening, where we demonize people, where there's a lot of trolling, there's kind of cancel culture and that kind of thing. And I think these are all the sort of like the symptoms, or the kind of these are examples of what I'm talking about with Mercury Algol. But I think what's so interesting is that, you know, Mercury in particular has become so strongly associated with modernity and, as I say, with technology and communication. And I love this quote by Tom Cheetham, where he says, "We are dominated, it seems, by Hermes," and of course Hermes is the Greek name for Mercury, god of boundaries and their violation, of communication, of language and lies, and the flash of inspiration. He is the god of the open road, of journeys, of twisting passages, of motion. He is our disease. He eats on the run at quick stops everywhere. So it kind of introduces this idea of the modern world that we kind of live in, and the sort of fast-paced nature of life, which very often prevents us from doing the sort of deep contemplation and sort of like, I don't want to say navel gazing, but just pausing to consider or think at a much more serious level about where we find ourselves, or the sort of the deeper significance of events. And that is really what Saturn is about in a lot of ways, particularly if we look at the work of Marsilio Ficino, who was very important in sort of like kickstarting or catalyzing the Renaissance. So Angela Voss, who is a former teacher of mine, is also she's a Ficino expert. She's written a book on Marsilio Ficino. And I was looking at some of her old work around Ficino, particularly her book, or it was an essay that preceded her book on Ficino. I think it was called Saturn and Divine Tears, something like that. And she says, as the authors of Saturn and Melancholy observe, Kronos, was just the Greek name for Saturn, in Homer and Hesiod, is a god of opposites. According to Homer, Kronos, as father of Zeus, Poseidon and Hades, is great. So isn't it interesting that we're talking about Jupiter, Poseidon being Neptune, and then Hades, which is Pluto. So those three planets which are quite prominent sort of at this new moon. So in terms of being the father of those three gods, if you like, so he was a Titan, is great, but he was also of crooked counsel. He is the benevolent god of agriculture, particularly in the Roman tradition, ruler of the Golden Age, but he's also the gloomy, dethroned, solitary god, exiled beneath the earth and the flood of the seas, as a Titan. He is the father of gods and men, but he's also the devourer of his own children, because of course Saturn, Saturn is the god of time, and of course time eats children in the sense that, everything that's young must eventually age. So time, is something that none of us mortals can kind of escape, and that's why Saturn is often pictured with a scythe, that eventually, as the god of old age and of time, we will all kind of be cut down at some point like wheat, as we sort of reach maturity or kind of old age. So he's a really interesting figure, very liminal himself. And, it's interesting that in the Hermetic tradition, he was often called Mercury Senex, so the elder Mercury. And I want to explore, as I say, the really interesting dynamic between these two Mercuries, because I think it can really, certainly for me, I found it sort of helped me to kind of open up to some fresh perspectives about things that maybe I'd got a little bit sort of stuck or stale. Now Saturn, on the other hand, as I was saying, he is the ruler of boundaries, in the sense of being the border between mortality and immortality. So Angela points this out. She says, beyond Saturn, this is in the astrological cosmos, the original kind of Platonic cosmos, lies the realm of the fixed stars, symbolically the divine mind in the sort of Neoplatonic system, because the fixed stars don't move and they are eternal. They are eternal points of light in the sky. And beyond that is the one itself, in the sense of Plotinus. So in the microcosm of the human soul, therefore, Saturn represents the furthest outreach of the human mind, its deepest connection with spiritual reality and intelligence, which borders on that of God. So this is, as I say, this is the sort of the spiritual contemplation that philosophers and so on cultivate in order to sort of like to realize or to kind of achieve wisdom. But I love these images. This is the kind of the iconography associated with both, and I thought it might be useful just to kind of get our imaginations sort of going as we move through this material. So on the left we've got this image of Mercury, and you can see that he's in his chariot, and he's got his caduceus, which is of course the wand, the wand of the magician, but and also the wand of the healer. And he's got his winged helmet on, so he's very much associated with the airy realm of thought, and he's being driven by two cockerels, which I didn't actually know this, but apparently cockerels are associated with Mercury because they tend to crow at dawn, and of course dawn is from a cosmological perspective when the sun rises from the underworld back into the world of men. So it moves from the lower hemisphere of the astrological chart over that ascendant line and into the realm of day. And so as such, we seem to kind of emphasize the liminality of Mercury and his ability to cross boundaries, much like daemons and angels can. So that's Mercury. And then on the other side we've got Saturn. We can see that he's sitting in his chariot with his scythe. So as I say, this is very much associated with this idea of collecting wheat, of harvesting wheat, and then he's being driven in his carriage by the dragon, and the dragon is very closely associated with Saturn I mean, first of all, because of being a guard, thresholds. We kind of talked about that in relation to Saturn and the seventh sphere of heaven, and the seemingly terrifying guardian, that's on the threshold of death. But it also has to do with this idea of time and the Ouroboros, of course, and with fate, because the dragon is also the symbol of the north and the south node. And of course, these are the two symbols most associated with kind of karma and dharma, and with kind of incarnation and karma and that kind of thing. As I was saying, Mercury is so much associated with liminality, crossing boundaries. And I thought this was a really interesting quote from the artist Vanessa Couto about this kind of liminality. So she says, crossing boundaries, both in our inner and outer lives, is a reality we all face daily. But how we negotiate this liminal space reveals much about how we relate to our own Mercury and Saturn, so our own kind of natal Mercury and Saturn. Each crossing is an initiation experience, and we must surrender and reveal who we are. So again, emphasizing this idea between boundaries, liminality, and initiation, which I want to sort of explore further. So I thought a nice way to kind of marry these two things up is to look at a quote from Marsilio Ficino's work, where he talks about Mercury and Saturn, and he says, the soul with an instrument or incitement of this kind, which is congruent in a way with the center of the cosmos, and as I might say, collects the soul into its own center, also seeks the center of all subjects and penetrates to the innermost core. And of course, it's worth saying that, in the ancient cosmology, this was the reason why the sun was at the center of the spheres. It wasn't at the top, it was in the center, because everything was about trying to find balance between sort of the upper and the lower, and this kind of marriage of mind and heart, and of kind of spirit and matter, because of soul, is of course a mixture of the two. So soul is congruent, moreover, with Mercury and Saturn, of whom the second, the highest of planets, carries the investigator to the highest subject. So that's Mercury, through kind of curiosity. From this come original philosophers, especially when their soul, called away from external movements and from its own body, is made in the highest degree both a neighbor to the divine and an instrument of the divine. So in other words, when Mercury becomes Saturn. As a result, it is filled from above with divine influences and oracles, and it always invents new and unaccustomed things and predicts the future. So in that sense, he's kind of saying that Mercury and Saturn are kind of movements of the soul, from, both sort of below to sort of down and up, and that they are almost two aspects of the same thing. This sort of the youthful curiosity of Mercury on the one hand, and then the kind of the wisdom of Saturn on the other. And so that's how he saw them, as being sort of two aspects of mind that need to be cultivated. I suppose much like, some people talk about the third eye and the crown, that, the crown is seen as being similar to Saturn, that sphere that's closest to the fixed stars and the divine, that can receive information, receive downloads, if you like, I want to talk in sort of modern terms, from higher sources on the one hand, and then Mercury, which through curiosity powers us sort of upwards to discover new things, and maybe to start with the third eye, which is so much about the sort of the rational mind of kind of knowledge on a human level, so kind of knowing things academically, or facts which have to do with 3D reality, and then kind of moving them up into a much more I suppose symbolic sense, where they start to kind of open up and we see like higher truths, more eternal kind of wisdom that one can distill from a lot of information. Now, we need to kind of put all these things together so that we can sort of finally move to the kind of the point that we want to sort of get to. So essentially what we're talking about here is the crossing of thresholds and boundaries, which both Mercury and Saturn are responsible for or associated with. But we're also talking about inversion. And one of the key sort of connecting factors here that links the sort of two these two things is the path to gnosis or initiation, particularly in the Hermetic tradition. And part of this is understanding what is called the ontological inversion. So Angela Voss really kind of teases this out quite nicely, where she says, one could say, like at a risk of a gross oversimplification, one could say that one of the ways that the Aristotelian and the Platonic methods of philosophizing were distinguished in the Renaissance was through the assignment of a human mode of investigation to the former and a divine mode of revelation to the latter. So the human mode of investigation is Aristotelian and kind of scientific, and it's really kind of lodged in what is immanent and embodied and what we can see and sort of like the information that we can gather from our five senses and from kind of observation and experience on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's this divine mode of revelation to the latter, which has to do with a kind of higher modes of knowledge, and these have to do with altered states of consciousness in which we open ourselves up to sort of higher, to different modes of seeing and being, and of different, of higher knowledge. But this requires us to cross a threshold. And that threshold is essentially Saturn, and this often involves overcoming our kind of our fears of death. So she kind of says human modes were characterized by rational, theoretical, and analytical attempts to grasp the world of nature through the observation and deduction of sense perception. So this is very to an extent rooted in sort of mercurial ways of being. And seeing, whereas divine modes embodied a deep intuitive sense of transcendent principles governing and emanating throughout creation, apprehended only through the highest intellectual principle in the soul, which recognized the images of its divine source. So in other words, its angel. So it sort of becomes aware of the relationship between the human being becomes aware of its relationship to its higher self, and this is one of the key goals of initiation. But unfortunately, due to what we tend to call the ontological inversion, so the shift in cosmology that happened at the turn of the century, or during the scientific enlightenment rather, we have this loss of the vertical dimension, and this cuts us off from the revelatory possibilities that are kind of afforded to us when we are living in a sort of an intelligent, interconnected cosmos. So Robert Romanyshyn kind of teases this out when he kind of says that the singular and monocular qualities of this way of knowing the world and being in it shape the eye of the mind in specific ways. So in other words, this Aristotelian or kind of scientific way of viewing the world. So between the spectator eye and the vanishing point, the world recedes towards an infinite horizon that is laid out as a flat plane. So in other words, you get the collapse of the vertical dimension into a flat plane. So a homogeneous space where all points are equal. In this flat expanse, the vertical depths of the world never rise above the horizon, creating a problem for Renaissance artists regarding how one might incorporate the halos of saints and the figures of angels within the same plane as human beings and the objects of everyday life. Because of course, in the old cosmology, you had this hierarchy, and now we don't like hierarchies, so we've collapsed everything into this kind of homogeneous level. Now, not only does this vision begin to erase the difference between the heavens and the earth, between the sacred and the profane, but it also lays the foundation for reducing phenomena that are qualitatively different to explanations that quantify them. In other words, sort of counting things. And I think, the person who really kind of embodies this the most is William Blake, particularly, his comments about Newton's sleep. And you can see that he, in his drawings, he sort of depicted the creator on the right with this kind of triangle pointing downwards. And then you've got man who thinks he's a god, Newton, who's kind of measuring things here on the earth with his what do you call it, his set square. And he's almost kind of parodying man, who now thinks that he's a god, because we've lost the sense of the sacred, we've lost the sense of anything being more important or greater than us. And of course, this is the one thing that Saturn instills in us, is this reverence or this kind of respect for authority. And that authority may not necessarily be human authority. It may in fact be spiritual authority. And this, I think, is really the key. This is where Saturn is really the guardian of the threshold, that often in order to pass that threshold into the kind of higher realms of consciousness, one needs a certain degree of reverence or kind of awe, if you like. So to an extent, to sort of a certain fear, if you like. And that this is really sort of the key to initiation in many traditions. But one of the other things that happens as a result of this collapsing of the cosmos into one sort of dimension, this so-called ontological inversion, is that we get this dichotomy or this Cartesian dualism happening between inside and outside. So rather than having sort of like things happening kind of up there in the sky, things tend to be interiorized. So we tend to sort of think more in terms of like our mind, our psychology, as being sort of the place where these things can happen. So in a world emptied of levels and differences, of quantities and colors, a new space is opened up within. It is the space of psychological life. Now as an interior domain of experience cut off from an inanimate world, because now the world is just, it's a machine and it's full of things that we can kind of utilize for our gratification, or for our sort of that have utility. So it is the space of vertical psychological depth now, separate from a horizontal material world of infinite expanse, that now kind of becomes the threshold. So it's now between kind of inside and outside. And I just want to kind of pause here and and play a clip from Robert Romanyshyn, because he kind of asks the question in terms of thresholds, like where is the therapeutic space now? And I'm just going to play a clip to you because I think you'll find it quite interesting.
So where then, back to our questions, where is the therapy room? Well, it's in that space that is a place marked by a threshold where the world and its suffering comes in with the person of the patient to live out stories in the figures who come to tell their tales. Psyche is not inside us. It belongs to the world. John Keats, one of your great English poets, says, let's call the world, or call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making. And of course, that was my training in phenomenology. It starts with the notion of the person as a being in the world. But that world today, that world where the patients cross the threshold, is very much, slowly, but almost every day more and more, becoming a digital world. We live more in digital space now than we do in the face-to-face encounter. We're doing this right now. And I'm not making a judgment about that. All I'm saying is that in the world that we live in today, this possibility is necessary and valuable. But for me, the danger is, or the crisis that this technology brings with it, with its own story, is that we will slowly begin to forget what we are losing when we leave the body behind. I'm not making a judgment about whether therapy in digital space or face-to-face is good or bad. I'm not doing that. I'm asking a more fundamental question. As we become more and more used to it, is the danger that we will begin to take that so easily as a new normal that we will begin to forget what we're leaving behind in our face-to-face encounter. Not only that, but as we become more adapted to it and even beguiled by its possibilities, will we forget that we have even forgotten and fall into a double amnesia? That's a question for me about technology, really, and has been at the core of my work. But for the moment, let me just add that I have thought somewhat about this issue, about what's the difference and what do we leave behind, the difference between therapy in the digital room, the digital space, and in the face-to-face. It's really one thing we leave behind. If you go back to that story about the rocking chair girl and the Anthony Hopkins story, what we leave behind is the gestural feel of embodiment, where we communicate, we impregnate each other with meaning through our gestures. Smile, tilt of the head, a wave of the hand. We can't do that, or we don't pick that up as much, because you're an image with sound, etc. But maybe I could make it clearer by saying it's in the digital space, we can't kiss each other. And why does that matter? Well, think about the poet E. Cummings. He who knows only the syntax of things, the meaning of things, will never wholly kiss you.
And now we return to this idea of kind of inversion and paradoxes, and of course of initiation. And as I say, the key to many initiation rituals is this idea of coming to face to face with death, and so in other words, coming up to the boundary of Saturn, the threshold of Saturn, and having to sort of like encounter what can often feel like quite a dangerous crossing. And a lot of the time what happens is that when this passage is actually made successfully, there is a kind of an inversion. So we move back into this sacred world of where the ontological inversion is reversed. So one of the most famous sort of examples of this comes from the writing of, I think it's a Roman author called Apuleius, and he talks about this initiate who undergoes the mysteries of Isis. So this was a mystery cult, quite famous and sort of well known at the time of the sort of at the Hellenistic period, when you kind of have this peak of these various mystery religions and cults. And he famously kind of says, at midnight I saw the sun shining as if it were noon. And really this epitomizes the idea of inversion. When the way that we traditionally see the world gets reversed, or kind of as I say, turned on its head. So it's interesting then that the midnight sun, this idea of the sun shining not at noon but at midnight, it very often marks the climax of the initiate's journey, when the initiate essentially encounters something sacred and numinous, but which is also sort of terrifying. A god or goddess or an angelic or spiritual being who reveals to him a great secret, and then an inversion of sorts takes place, a stage often marked by a reversal of the process that takes place in the upper world, in which a light is born from or shines in the darkness. And this is a really, really key point that we're going to come back to, is this idea of black light. But the way that Angela kind of puts it in the context of the Sufi tradition and of the Hermetic tradition is that the angel exists in another dimension to that of time and matter. So in other words, beyond the realm of the seventh sphere of Saturn. Yet, paradoxically, it can only be recognized through it, in other words, through time and matter, through penetrating to the depths of our world to reach a place where, to quote Tonchitum, the world turns inside out and reveals its hidden secrets. So there's this inversion, or this kind of turning inside out of the psychological into the world around us. The world of psyche becomes sort of everywhere. And what's really happening is that we're moving back into that old way of thinking, that old sort of view of the cosmos, that experience of the cosmos in which it is a kind of an intelligent whole, and where it can speak to us. And so now we kind of come back to this idea of Saturn and black light, because of course Saturn is so sort of associated, first of all, with lead, with black, and also with the first stage of initiation, particularly in alchemy. It's associated with Nigrada, with that kind of depression that often leads to ego death, and it is from there that the initiation can really begin, because we now let go of everything that we thought. We let go of kind of preconceived ideas of ourselves and the world, and we kind of almost dissolve. Our ego dissolves, and we dissolve into this kind of liminal state where we can be remade. So the Luma Natura is a theme that you constantly get in alchemical literature, and it's essentially a dark light, a luminosity in the darkness of matter, and you get it in all sorts of traditions, from kind of shamanism to many of the Hermetic traditions, as well as things like Dionysius the Areopagite, I think that's how you say his name, where there is this idea of being completely ignorant, and then from that ignorance almost something emerging, like this little kernel that then starts to kind of grow, the seed of light that then starts to kind of grow. And it's interesting that Robert Romanyshyn talks about this book by Stanton Marlin, which is quite well known now, called The Black Sun, where he presents a well-documented critique of Jungian psychology's addiction to light. Well, it's not just Jungian psychology, it's sort of the whole kind of Christian tradition, or this tradition of the salvation of light, to our addiction to insight, to knowledge, and to the place that is given to the light of the mind, which is so kind of prominent in Western culture. And that his book addresses this need for a psychology of darkness. In other words, in Jungian terms, it would be addressing the darkness of the subconscious. And of course, in many other traditions, it's addressing the darkness within ourselves of our fear of death, for example, of coming to terms with what is unknowable. That image of the black hole, the kind of the womb and the tomb. But what's so interesting, as I say, is its link to Saturn, and how, in this sense, Saturn becomes the kind of initiator, the threshold that we have to cross in order to move into the other colours associated with initiation. So we go from black to green and so on. And of course, this brings us face to face with this idea of the terror of death, and of and our kind of our fear of monsters and demonization. So it brings us all the way back to the idea of the daemon and of Saturn as this kind of this terrifying figure of kind of, you know, the figure of authority who's going to sort of oppress us, who doesn't want us to kind of grow, who forces us to sort of confront things maybe we don't want to, that puts restrictions on us and all this kind of thing. And I think it fits really well with what Robert Romanyshyn is saying about where we are at the moment with this collapsed cosmos in terms of our relationship to the sacred. And he actually says that if we embody the principle of inversion, that the place that we need to look for the sacred is actually with the monster, with what we demonize. So I'm going to play you another a clip from a talk that he gave called Musing with Monsters, and you can hear what he has to say about that.
What the shadow of technology in the Frankenstein book is teaching us is the danger of acting as if we are gods and that we are not under the sign of something larger than ourselves that I call the sacred. So I wouldn't use the term that we need a new religion. We need to recover a sense of the sacred. However, we understand that. And what goes with the sacred in the community sense? The sense of ritual. We don't have that anymore. It's been, you know, the ritual of giving thanks at Thanksgiving in America means that you go and you stuff yourself with turkey and you all get drunk and you have political arguments. What about the ritual sense of coming together at community time to celebrate something that is larger than ourselves? Gratitude, Thanksgiving, Christmas, even Halloween. There's something sacred about Halloween, of making a place like Roman Carnival, where the children dress up and give a place. It's our debased version of the Roman Carnival, but there is still some seeds there about recovering something larger than ourselves, by which I mean the sacred. And because Victor Frankenstein cuts his ties off with nature, and it's the feminine figures who die because of his hubris and acting as if he's a god, the sacred, and I try to make that clear in the book, is carried by the monster. He's our God face. Oftentimes the parts that we isolate, we call devil, demon, monster, that's where our God face is. That's where the sacred lies. So you see what I'm doing. I'm engaging in this work of inversion, going to the margins, attending to those figures and inverting things. What we would demonize, now we have to regard.
So, you know, this is, I think, really the crux of it. You know, Robert Romanyshyn is talking about how we make monsters, and he says we split off what we don't like in ourselves. We deny that it's there, and we find somebody to put it on. And we see this, as I say, all the time, like on social media, where we kind of demonize people and we sort of project a lot of hate onto them. Like, you think about cancel culture and that kind of thing. So basic primitive psychological mechanisms that kind of make us separate ourselves from others. And he says if we keep doing that, we're in for disaster. And I think we really are at a kind of like a key. It feels to me like we're at a kind of pivot point culturally, where we're starting to become aware of how we do these things, like over and over. We scapegoat people, and maybe this is an opportunity to sort of do something different, you know, to sort of take the projections back and to actually put them into the alchemical vessel and to work with them and to actually see, by cooking them over and working with them, what we learn about ourselves, but also the way we relate to the world and to other people. So here's where, for me, it gets really fascinating, where we talk about the story of Frankenstein. So this is another quote from a paper by Robert Romanyshyn, and I will put a link to his website in the description box. So he says, in the turbulent times in which we live, Mary Shelley's story can be read as both a prophecy of many of the crises we face today and as a beacon of hope for transforming them. So this is what I really want to emphasize, is this aspect of hope. So created by Victor Frankenstein, the monster is his mind child. So interesting, we talk about the mind here. Created apart from woman and abandoned by his maker. But he's never named by his creator, and he nevertheless lingers in the collective imagination, where his shadow reveals the psychological depths of the wide world. He is the companion who opens our eyes to what it is like to be an orphan and a refugee without an identity, a history, or a community. He awakens us to the archetypal longing for home, and this is the key. This is the sort of the crux of the issue, is, what is it that feels like home, and what does that mean? And of course this takes us into the opposite energy of Saturn, which is the moon. We think about the archetypes of mother and father, we're talking about Saturn and the moon. And so kind of in returning to this idea of this kind of desire for home, we are returned to the archetype of the orphan, and of course who is the sort of the epitome of this bit Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And what I think is so interesting is what Robert Romanyshyn has to say about this. So he says, to shift the image, if we think in exile, so in other words, if we think from that place of Saturnian isolation or loneliness, that feeling of separation that we all kind of feel as a result of this process of kind of being cut off from the vertical dimension of the cosmos, first of all, so from the sacred, and then secondly from the world, because we've become so interiorized, that therein lies the seeds of our return. So in other words, another inversion can happen, a second inversion. And isn't it interesting that the archetype of the orphan, in a lot of ways is quite mercurial. This is the streetwise kind of urchin who learns to sort of survive on his wits, on the streets. And I think it's really interesting how we then come full circle from kind of Saturn back to Mercury. So just to kind of read the quote from Robert Romanyshyn, he says, to shift the image, thinking in exile awakens the orphan within us, and who better than the homeless orphan to experience the desire to find a way home? So this is the ultimate symbol of the initiate, who desires, who in his soul knows that that he comes from somewhere else, that even though we're kind of the experience on earth is meant to be a joyful one, and that embodiment is not a sin, that we can get stuck here, number one. And that's the converse side of Saturn, in the sense of the devil. If you think about the devil card in the tarot, even though it is the traditional symbol of the kind of cloven hooved goat, which is of course the symbol of Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, really what it is the kind of it is the shadow side of Venus. So it's the shadow side of too much sex, too much food, addictions, the sort of the converse side of embodiment, where we get trapped in the sort of the pleasures of the flesh, if you like. And so this need to sort of this kind of desire to return home is it's a paradoxical one, because we are kind of essentially souls that come from somewhere else. We're actually aliens here on earth in that sense. And so there is always going to be a part of us that feels like the orphan, that wants to kind of return home to the world of spirit, and that's what can kind of drive the process of seeking, truth seeking, and the kind of spiritual journey. But equally, as Angela's pointing out, part of initiation is being able to have that experience of almost, not necessarily heaven on earth, but on being able to turn the world inside out, and to experience the world and earthly life and embodiment in a more spiritual way. So in a more, in a soulful way. And that this is the sort of the potential that this relationship between Mercury and Saturn offers us, in terms of shifting our consciousness and making us see things in a different way, to almost being reborn into a new way of relating to the world around us and to the cosmos. So it's interesting that he goes on and he says, we shouldn't demonize technology either. It's not necessarily the fault of technology. So that's not the issue or the problem. He says what is the problem is our collective amnesia for the origins of technology. That's the issue and the problem. So he says, in this forgetfulness, technology as a way of being in the world, so an ontology, becomes the measure of what is true and real. So in other words, we behave like machines. So technology as a perspective becomes an ontology, and its forgotten origins become the fabric of a collective unconsciousness that permeates the world. Its symptomatic character calls us back to those origins for the sake of a new beginning that takes up with more consciousness and awareness the possibility of technology is also a homecoming. So that's really interesting. So a way of also redeeming technology ultimately. So really what he's talking about here is this shift back to a reversal of the ontological inversion. We return to the more sacred relationship that we have with the universe and with the world and with nature and that kind of thing, that we use technology to enhance that experience rather than to take us further away from it, to try and escape from it. So ultimately, as I say, we kind of come full circle. We've got this idea of youth and old age and this notion of complementarity, that Mercury and Saturn need each other. So Vanessa Couto again kind of says Mercury needs Saturn's steady hand to guide him, the hand of the mentor or the father or the teacher, while in turn Mercury lends Saturn's taciturn stance a less grim and pessimistic view of the world. So kind of returning that sense of joy and delight and a playfulness to Saturn, who can sometimes be overly serious. So it gives the Lord of Time some much needed air and levity. And of course it gives Mercury a little bit more reverence for authority and also, perhaps a little bit more depth. So Senex and Puer need each other, even if this may at times be a prickly union. So I thought that was a nice way to sort of end this particular forecast. As I say, I do realize that it may be sort of long and convoluted, but I thought, it's an interesting journey, and I think it really helps us to kind of, again, to rescue those disparate parts of us that might feel quite kind of split as a result of the current way that we live. And then as a kind of final note, I thought this was really interesting. I've come across this before, actually, but in the Kabbalistic system, Saturn is actually associated not with kind of a masculine archetype, but with a feminine archetype, with the archetype of Binah on the sort of the tree of life. So Binah is associated with a great mother in a lot of respects, and I just thought this was such an interesting inversion of Saturn, as the father, that it was worth kind of looking at. So I found this quote on a website, I can't remember which one now, but it says, in Kabbalah, the sphere of Binah separates the undifferentiated divine realm of potential from the multiform complex realm of manifestation. So in astrology, Saturn is the outermost of the planets, and her orbit is the gateway, the border between the unchangeable, unmoving divine world, so that of the fixed stars, and the moving, changeable world of the planets, from the world of the formless to the world of the form. And this is really key in sort of Platonic cosmology. They talk about the same versus the different and that kind of thing. The eternal versus, time and so on. So yeah, I thought it was an interesting way of ending this particular journey, because it brings us back to the feminine, and of course that has been largely excluded from these stories. So that's kind of it from me. I know it's been a bit of a long one, and hopefully I haven't made it too boring and kind of drawn out or preachy, but it really kind of interested me, and I just wanted to sort of share it in case it resonated with other people. But if you're interested in more of my work, do kind of check it out on my website. I do have a newsletter that goes out twice monthly for the sort of at the new moon and the full moon, and that gives you access to monthly horoscopes and a couple of other things like discounts and that kind of thing. So if you are interested, check out the subscribe page on my website. There is a free tier. But yeah, I really am wishing you all the very best for this 2-week period. It does feel like, on some level, like a pivotal shift. I don't know why, but it just does. And as I say, maybe it is the tail end of that lunar eclipse energy, but it does feel like there's sort of quite a big ending happening, and that will phase out over the next sort of 2 months or so. Because, as I say, lunar eclipses do take about 3 months to sort of fully discharge their energy. But I hope that this new moon brings you a lot of fresh perspectives and new ways of seeing things, and in that sense brings with it hope and sort of renewal. So sending you lots and lots of love, and all the very best, and take care until we meet again.